Normally, I love to work at the BBC archives, but during the last week, I have really come to despise my job. Don't get me wrong, I still like the idea of working at a place where my knowledge about old TV shows actually is of any practical use. The archives does, however, also contain documents of the most deep-seated depravity on the planet, and things that shouldn't even be on this planet, but yet are. So which types of archival material that exist in the BBC archives can really be so terrible that you despise your own interest and don't want to work there anymore? I can hear about 3/5 of the readers of this post thinking right now. Is it graphic news clips, weird cartoons from Eastern Europe, with the most horrible dubs you can think of, or some grainy footage in some homemade video from the 90s? When I proposed that I myself would take on the task of looking through the contents of an obscure VHS collection somewhere deep into one of the archive's long lines of shelves to my boss Friday last week, I thought this exact same thing. I'm used to the grainy visuals, horrible audio, and despite me being a millennial, I'm not the slightest bit oversensitive. The hesitance the older archivists expressed about getting this assignment during the morning meeting was therefore unexplainable for me at the point. Maybe they were the sensitive ones, I proudly thought when I made the offer to check through all the content in the VHS collection and got a yes for my suggestion from my boss. When the meeting was finished, I went down from the office to the proper part of the archives I'd learned to know and love so much during the last months with my colleague, Cassandra Polyakov. The archive is the home of many archive TV shows I had loved as a child, and among them is the relatively obscure 90s children cartoon Christopher Crocodile. As a side note, I also wanted to admit that I had a habit of smuggling out episodes of this show from the archives and let my nephew watch it together with me. And to my sister's great and hilarious annoyance, is exactly as fond of the cartoon as I was as a 6-year-old. There were quite some expectations in my head right when I went down to the archive that I would find a similar kids cartoon in the collection that I could smuggle out to my nephew. While Cassandra and I went down to the archive's vault for VHS tapes, my satisfaction with my job were therefore unusually high, but my colleague did instead look strangely worried. When asked what the matter was with her, she just answered, "I looked through some of the videotapes for some years ago, and you'll definitely soon understand why I and the other archivists don't want to make a complete description of the content in the collection." Down in the archive there was an old TV set with a VHS player standing not too far from the shelves themselves. I then looked to my note, which contained the information about what collection would have its content described by me, and saw that it was a collection of 4 on the VHS shelf. It was not at all a large collection. It did only contain 7 boxes, and all combined only have videotapes with the registration numbers 010175-0001 to 310106-0007. As I took down all the boxes from their shelf, Cassandra told me that, "If you can't stand watching all of it, just go to the poster vault. I'll be working with a project about the eventual deforesting of our poster collection, so if you need it, I'll always be there for you." Despite me getting a bit irritated by her apparently talking down to me like I'm a child, I went directly to the VHS player with my laptop on my knee so I could finally start my work on the project. The shelf in question was specifically dedicated to videotapes, which was not sent in by any of the larger media producers in the country. Tapes could, for example, be from small journalistic news agencies or even private citizens from all over Britain and the rest of the world. As I looked through the first box in the collection, I directly saw that many of the cassettes were placed in a completely wrong box. Together with the tapes from 1975 and 1980, you could, for example, find a number of cassettes from the 90s and even the 2000s. This terrible sorting was in stark contrast to the professional placing of archival material which otherwise was the norm for the BBC archives, and I therefore wondered if any of the other archivists had really looked through the collection since the collection were put here. The first tape I put in was a cheap dub of a Czechoslovak cartoon that apparently was about 2 little blackbirds, but since the visuals were so grainy it could as well have been about 2 magpies, and since the voice quality was so bad, about 10% of it was even comprehensible, did the dialogue give no clue. One could easily understand why the videotape was rejected, and therefore it was natural for me to write in the digital register that this was a broken tape. The following 5 tapes were also of low-quality recordings, of probably homemade dubs of obscure cartoons from Eastern Europe like Professor Balthazar and Erstadt, and therefore all of these ended up with the broken tape category of metadata. But the next tape, which was also the last in the box, was, however, not a cartoon. It was instead a collection of recordings of newsreels, which was all about a great theft from the Victoria and Albert Museum during the autumn of 1978. Apparently there were 10 pots made of Ming Dynasty china that had been stolen by someone that the police expected was one of the museum's employees. The tape was rather unremarkable, except from one moment where an old woman in the green coat that was in the background of the police's discussion pointed directly towards the camera. But that happened early during the tape's runtime, so therefore it quickly left my attention. The last tape in the box did only feature static with some random footage from some Frank Zappa concert. This was also the last tape I watched during this working day. So at this point, my thoughts were more on what I should do when I get home than about the short fourth wall break in the second to last video I saw. During the morning next working day, Cassandra asked me, "Are you sure you still want to continue the VHS tape project?" Naturally, I just told her, why would I not want to continue my work? It's not like any of the tapes contain any graphic content or something. Cassandra then said, "Well, it will soon be more graphic. Then you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about." Please, I've already seen virtually every single nasty video which was on the list during the Thatcher era. So really, what can be so horrible from that collection? I went straight down to the archives again. Now it's time to look through the contents of the box with video cassettes from 1981 to 1985. The first tape seemed to be a pilot of a series called In a Castle in Burgundy, and its plot centered around a dramatized story about the 100 Years' War. Duke Philip, the main character of the show, had apparently lost his gold to a French king, and it was therefore his and some other knight's mission to steal his gold back. The budget had to have been extremely high, because the quality of this scenery had the quality one could expect from the high-profile 80s Hollywood movie. Only in the episode's last scene, I got a clue about why the series had not shown on the BBC. It was during a battle between the French king, on one side, Duke Philip, and one King Henry of England, when the aforementioned main character suddenly died from an arrow fired from the direction of the camera. But instead of a cheesy death scene like one could expect in a half-serious series like this, it was a both gory and traumatic experience to watch. Duke Philip moaned in front of the camera for almost 5 minutes before he fell silent, with his seemingly closest man, Baron Lumont, on his side. But immediately after this strange scene was over, I suddenly saw the Baron pointing towards the camera, as if it was I who shot the arrow. After this, the episode just ended, without even any end credits showing up. The rest of the tapes in the box did, however, only contain cheesy 80s cartoons and newsreels about mundane subjects, so it didn't take long for me to recover from all that. During Wednesday the same week, it was time to dive into the collection of the box with videotapes from 1986 to 1990. Even here did the cassettes, with only one exception, contain only the most harmless and ordinary material one could imagine. It was newsreels, political debates, cheap cartoons, and footage from different sports events. But one videotape touched completely unexpected events for both the time period and the themes of the overall content in the collection so far. According to the title card and the subtitles of the video, it was some strange combination of a documentary and a newsreel about the Chinese Cultural Revolution during 1966. And the overall quality of the visuals also suggested that it was filmed around this year. It all started with some kids in green uniforms storming into a classroom somewhere in rural China, and after that came the surroundings of the person who appeared to be their teacher. She was a young woman, only about 2 or 3 years older than me, and the subtitles revealed her to be in great distress. The teacher repeatedly told the children that her father had fought in the Red Army during the Civil War, and that this meant she wasn't a daughter to a reactionary. But the children did obviously not listen and just screamed things like capitalist, Kuomintang supporter, and Western spy, and soon started to pull on the poor woman's hair. They then dragged her into an old temple which was decorated with red banners, adorned with Chinese characters. The floor inside the temple was full of shards of what seemed to be a combination of broken glass and the now smashed ceramic statues which had previously stood in the center of it. When the children had dragged her into this former house of worship, they forced the weeping teacher to kneel upon the shard-covered floor. All this as the cameramen themselves seemed to be in the crowd that did this atrocity, and I therefore wondered if this was some kind of private snuff film made by some of the Red Guards, because no one could reasonably think that this was good propaganda for any political aim, no matter how evil this aim would be. But before any more torture of the poor woman happened, I once again saw a finger pointing towards me. This time it was a boy who couldn't be more than 12 years old, and he pointed at me for 3 whole minutes before the recording just stopped. In this moment, I naturally felt a bit creeped out and confused about this returning feature in this collection. Could it really be a coincidence that random people in the videos just started pointing towards the camera? I thought this for the whole evening. But by the next morning, I decided it was my duty to look through the whole collection, regardless of how disturbing the content was. Because if I could continue working on this project, it would be likely that no one else on the archive could. And this day, it really did get more disturbing. It was at this point, looking through the content of the box with tapes 1991 to 1995. Every tape in that box had harmless content except for one, who had the title 39th Action, and the year was 1994. Once again, it started looking like an unfinished homemade video documentary, and this time the subject was neo-Nazism. The first 45 minutes did just contain footage from rallies where people were screaming at each other, but this format then ended, abruptly. Instead, the recording showed a grey cellar room where an old man sat alone, bound to a chair. Then a masked figure came along and held a large, broad dagger to his neck. The context now made it clear I was witnessing a neo-Nazi snuff film, and in this moment, I was close to fainting because of the realization of what was likely to happen with the old man. But at the last second, again, a figure showed up on the camera and pointed at it. This time it was yet another masked figure who was pointing at me, and in the background, one could hear the poor man screaming for his life without seeing any of this. The video only ended when he couldn't scream anymore. Naturally, I went to Cassandra directly after this and told her that I had to stop working on this project. Since it wasn't her authority to get someone else working with this part of the archive, we had to go up and talk to our boss, Simon Chamberlain, to get this through. He firstly seemed positive to offer one of my colleagues to take over the task, but when Simon heard how far I'd come, he suddenly started to insist that it was me who had to finish the project. When we asked him why someone else couldn't take over the register that I had written, he just said, "You will understand why soon. Or did you want to get fired this early in your employment?" To avoid getting fired, I therefore went down to the archive again to watch the content for the rest of the videotapes in the box that covered the period 1991 to 1995. Luckily for me, the rest of the content of all these tapes were harmless things like cheaply made cartoons. Next day also had a calm start. The 1996 to 2000s box did, for example, have many weird but, in my situation, calming videos which I recognized from YouTube. Among some of these were what I knew under the name Pink Morning Cartoon, which contained strange and grainy visuals combined with the equally strange song, Everything Coming Up Spring. Despite how many people on the internet who think this cartoon is creepy, this was still a nice sight for me, since I had endured snuff films and the most bewildering fourth wall breaks I could imagine. So later, during the same day, I looked at the videotapes in the box covering the years 2001 to 2006. I had essentially regained the will to complete the project. Because what things could possibly be in this last box, which could be worse than I'd already witnessed? All of these videotapes were also completely harmless, except for the last one. This had the strangest title, Meta Real Trial 199300123. Is this some sort of art film or what? I thought whilst I put the last tape in the VHS player. But when I saw the title card, my face went marble white because of the surprise. The text was red, and read, Thomas Ashbury, born on the 23rd of January, 1993. Crimes, art theft, torture, and 2 murders. This was my name, and birth year. So I naturally thought this was some kind of strange prank made by someone else on the archive. But before I'd even come up with the proposal about who did it in my mind, I suddenly saw my own face on the screen. It was clearly full of fear when I saw it. And after some second, it became obvious that this was a perfect copy of myself, sat in a gigantic pillared hall I had definitely no recollection of being in. Then the camera shifted towards a judge's desk, and there sat a large man with red hair and a moustache and white wig. No one else seemed to be present in this courtroom, and when the judge spoke, it echoed. He said, I am Brandon Fitzgerald, Supreme Judge of the 8th Section of Material Justice System. The copy of me then talked with a terrified voice. What's the 8th Section of the Material Justice System, and what am I accused of? The Supreme Judge then said without even a trace of compassion present. Don't play innocent. Everyone on this plane knows exactly what you have done. 1 theft of Ming Dynasty china from Victoria and Albert Museum. 1 murder of an actor in the cancelled TV series In a Castle in Burgundy. 1 act of participation in a severe case of aggravated assault on Maoist China and combined hate crime and murder motivated by neo-Nazi ideology. My clone now moaned and said with an increasingly pathetic voice, But I was only a bystander in all those cases. It's those pointing people, they've all lied to you. The judge, however, just shrugged and told the copy of me that, If you were innocent, you would never have entered this meta-real plane, and you can't just defend your actions with claiming that you don't know the laws of meta-reality. Because like it says in the 12th paragraph, it applies for everyone who enters this plane of existence, regardless of the person in question knows them or not. I therefore sentence you to death by decapitation. My clone was now fixed in position like a statue, and at this moment a new person entered the courtroom from seemingly nowhere. It was a man completely dressed in tight black clothing, with a porcelain pot in his hand. He went to the judge's desk and smashed it, grabbing one of their shards and running directly towards the copy of me. He then drew it like a knife along the neck of the clone. The blood sprayed in a way that could only be compared to a water fountain, and the man didn't stop until he had cut through the entire neck, and the head of the clone fell down onto the marble floor. In this moment, I started to suddenly scream uncontrollably, but in that second the screen cut to black, the video unmistakably over. With my laptop in hand, I then ran straight up to the office, still screaming, until I had arrived to the place where my boss's desk was. I told him directly everything about the content of the last videotape, and then proposed the whole collection, or at least the specific videotape, had to be destroyed. But with total calm in my boss's voice and face, his response was, Finally, an employee that got the meta-real trial tape as the last tape in the collection. For some magical reason, it changes its position for every single one who looks through the collection, and everyone else on this archive has gotten it much earlier during the registration process. Your wage will therefore be raised with several £1,000s. When I asked him what meta-real was, he finally gave me an explanation about the true nature of the collection. The meta-reality is apparently some realms of self-conscious fiction, which are possibly the source of many of mankind's mythologies. It can change itself to fit the mindset of its observers, and sometimes it can find its way into the hands of normal people. VHS Collection 4, for rejected tapes, have a long time been known to contain some videotapes with direct connections to the material plane. Since beings from this metaphysical realm have a tendency to act aggressively towards outsiders, no one on the archive had previously managed to look through the entirety of the collection. But since I had now practically finished the registration of its contents, the entrances to the material had apparently been mapped out. My boss also insisted that the archive, according to the law, had an obligation to map out and preserve these entrances. So I didn't get the permission to destroy any of the videotapes in the collection. Now, when I'm filling the last details in the register, I do truly hope that no one else will get the idea to search for anything in this collection.